put the YouTube link, tweet it to somebody, text it to somebody. You are going to want to see this amazing conversation that we're getting ready to have here at the Way and here in the Bay Area. This is a great joy. Many of you know for quite some time we've tried to help host here in the Bay Area some of our foremost thought leaders and activists and organizers who are on the front lines of justice and social transformation, and certainly those who are doing it as an outgrowth of their faith and their values. And so super excited to be able to bring this wonderful conversation to you today. I'm going to read the bio of our special guest, Rahiel Tesfamariam. She is the author of her new book called Imagine Freedom. And we are so grateful that she's come all the way from Washington, D.C. to be in the building with us. Let's clap our hands and just appreciate that she's here today. Rahiel Tesfamariam is an award-winning activist, journalist, theologian, and speaker. A former Washington Post columnist, she is the founder of Urban Cusp, a cutting-edge online community highlighting faith, social change, culture, and global awareness. Rahiel is a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Divinity School, where she was the inaugural William Sloane Coffin Jr. Scholar for Peace and Justice. At the age of 23, she served as the youngest editor-in-chief in the history of the Washington Informer newspaper. She has over 2 decades of organizing experience with national and international social justice organizations. Amidst the Ferguson uprising, Rahiel led Not One Dime, a national economic boycott. For years, she has worked in Africa, organizing with Pan-African movements across the continent. Rahiel has traveled the world on various delegations and humanitarian projects. She has spoken at prestigious universities and historic churches throughout the nation. And as a generational voice, she has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Ebony, Elle, and on BET and Revolt TV. Essence Magazine named Rahiel one of the nation's new civil rights leaders. Her debut book, Imagine Freedom, Transforming Pain into Political and Spiritual Power, is now available wherever books are sold. And so we are, again, so grateful to have her here and look forward to not only her sharing parts of her book with us, but also engaging in a sit-down conversation with myself and one of our most amazing national leaders who happens to pastor the historic Allen Temple Baptist Church here in the city of Oakland, the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Thompson as well. And so super excited for the conversation that will follow. But the next voice you will hear will be the wonderful, amazing, magnanimous Rahiel Tesfamariam. She is going to start off by reading some excerpts of her book and giving us just some grounding on what this book means to her and why now and why this moment, and just give us a sense of what she hopes the book conveys generally, and then we'll come back after about 30 minutes or so and engage in a conversation together, all right? Put your hands together, everyone, for Rahiel Tesfamariam.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. This is an honor. It's actually my first time being able to do a reading of my own words. I'm very used to conversation Q&A, but this is so exciting to actually read the words. The only other time I did that was during the Audible studio recording. So I have to thank Pastor Mike for having me, my comrade and dear friend. We have been all over the world together. And so I was telling him the last time I was in California was actually here at the Way for the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party formation. And so I want to thank him for, always bringing me to the place where I actually got saved. California is where I found Christ, so it will always be a sacred ground for me. I also want to thank my sister who's here today to be in conversation with us, who I always remind her she knew me before I knew Christ. We knew each other when I was a youngster in Washington, D.C. at Shiloh Baptist Church. And so this is a full circle moment with my big sister and big brother in Christ. And so thank you for coming out on a Saturday, and thank you for getting me away from that heat wave on the East Coast. Woo! To this beautiful California weather. A little chilly, though. Yeah, I didn't expect that. It's a little chilly. So this is my baby, Imagine Freedom. I have a toddler, and I consider Imagine Freedom my second born. And, you know, I didn't expect to do this, but I'm actually going to start by reading from the first line of the book to just get you a sense of the conditions in which I wrote this book. The evolution of Imagine Freedom is bookended between the birth of my daughter and the deaths of 4 of my matriarchs, between infinite hope in the unborn future and ineffable experiences of suffering. This book is my generational love offering, a compilation of conversational letters, prayers, and philosophical explorations of Black liberation written during personal seasons of trauma and rebirth. As I was navigating my own journey, I felt intimately connected to the pain and power of people of African descent worldwide. Through Imagine Freedom, I seek to examine how our quest for freedom and healing are knitted together. It is my belief that freedom and healing are not destinations, but instead journeys to the past, the present, and the future. To actualize freedom, we must be able to reimagine ourselves, our communities, and our relationship to Africa. But there are also freedoms and ways of being that require reclamation and decolonization. The next part of the book that I want to take you to is this idea of a Black Eden, a place that is a fantastic voyage for Black Americans, an Afrofuturistic journey to the past, present, and future. This leads me to think about freedom within the context of Eden, the setting for the early chapters of the book of Genesis. The story tells of how we fell out of God's grace when Adam and Eve were disobedient by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Their banishment from Eden disconnected us from the earthly paradise that God sought to offer, leaving us forever cursed and destined to grow old and die. Countless volumes have been written about our exile from Eden and have explored what a return to Eden would look like. Dismissing the possibility of a physical return to Eden, many have focused on other conduits, whether spiritual, psychological, or emotional, to earthly paradise. In post-colonial imagination and feminist theology, theologian Kwapu Lan writes, "The New World and the tropical islands had a strong attraction for European men, for they had projected onto these distant lands the images of the lost Garden of Eden or the much sought-after paradise to ease the social and psychic ills of Europe." Poulan suggests that the search for Eden, particularly for Europeans, has often been tied to escapism and conquest. Indigenous peoples suffer due to European claims to territory that is not their own. I will repeat that one. Indigenous peoples suffer due to European claims to territory that is not their own. Historically, colonizers have carved out an Eden for themselves in every corner of the globe, leading to institutionalized cruelty. In contrast, the Black Eden is not a colonial endeavor. It is about reconceptualizing freedom and our collective dreaming. As we seek to constantly redefine what human liberation means to us, Eden can be envisioned through a lens of Afrofuturism. This allows us to be the architects of our own Black future, designing and constructing an unborn, glorious world on the terrain of infinite imagination. Eden then becomes the epicenter of freedom, and we all become authors, inventors, and animators of a fantastical reality unlike anything in our past or present, As a people and generation with a legacy of prophecy and poetic imagination, what are our Afrotopian daydreams? How would we narrate our vision of an ideal Black world? What is the Afrofuturistic backdrop of our most precious prayers for Black life? Eden does not have to be a specific destination that we return to or voyage toward, but a state of individual and collective being, a symbolic place devoid of all forms of oppression. May the day come when we reclaim a paradise where we are not imprisoned by other people's opinions of who we are meant to be, what we should do, and how we look. There is an earthly and internal haven that we can create where we have forsaken the tricks and traps of capitalism and white supremacy. Eden is the site of refuge where we can draw a line between an inner affirming voice and the judgmental, controlling voice of society. In Eden, our minds are not bound by fear and anxiety, and our bodies are not subjected to judgment and condemnation. We instead understand our bodies as instruments of purpose, power, and pleasure. So now I want to take you to trauma, the chapter on trauma. Originally, when I was thinking about writing this book, the concept came to me during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the whole world was in a state of trauma. And there was a lot of grief and a lot of pain. And so I thought of writing a book about trauma. But I felt like we can't just sit in the trauma forever. And I asked myself, well, what's on the other side of trauma? And the word that kept coming to me was healing, healing, healing. And healing is not even enough because healing is too often individualistic. So then how do you make healing collective? And the word freedom came to me, freedom. So the intersection of freedom and healing is the other side of trauma for me. And there was a lot of trauma that I experienced during the various stages of writing this book. I talk about it when I talk about the birth of my daughter, but I also talk about the loss of the women in my life. So here is a paragraph on trauma. Trauma is unwanted touches and uninvited intimacy. Trauma is bearing a lifelong secret that smothers the soul. It's never having enough or feeling like enough. Trauma is wounds of loss, betrayal, violation, and inexplicable grief. It's the absence of someone or something that leaves a void nothing else can fill. Trauma is and will always be empty cabinets that lead to empty stomachs. For what is trauma? But what is poverty but endless trauma? Trauma is anything and everything that hurts the human spirit as much as birth pangs hurt the body. And just as the postpartum period has lingering effects on a woman's mood and physical well-being, trauma to the soul also reconfigures the anatomy and foundation of who we are. So I wanted to take you to the chapter on Ferguson because in the chapter on Ferguson, I actually interviewed Pastor Mike. We were comrades in Ferguson, and we actually took a delegation of Ferguson organizers to Paris together. So that was a powerful experience. We went to London as well. And so I wrote this chapter, but interviewed him during that time. So this is an excerpt in which I interviewed Pastor Mike. While writing this chapter, I interviewed Pastor Mike about the Ferguson uprising and his role in it. He spoke about the parallels to the ongoing and at times violent protests that broke out in Oakland, California in the aftermath of Oscar Grant being killed by a Bay Area rapid transit BART police officer on New Year's Day in 2009. The inauguration of President Barack Obama 3 weeks after the killing of Grant was a Kairos moment, Pastor Mike said. While the officer who killed Grant was charged with manslaughter, he was released after only 2 years. Fruitvale Station, a film directed by Oakland-born Ryan Coogler and starring Michael B. Jordan, brought Oscar Grant's story in the issue of police brutality to national attention in 2013, 1 year prior to the killing of Mike Brown Jr. In highlighting what made the Ferguson uprising unique, Pastor Mike told me, Ferguson was a turning point in our generation's fight, a culmination of all the energies, wisdom, and experiences that happened before then. I think it's important because of everything that has happened in recent months to read this small part in which I talk about the parallels between Ferguson and Palestine. So, where are we? Trying to find it, but I'll probably come back to it. We're going to go to Pan-African double consciousness. This is the chapter on Pan-Africanism where I talk about my own identity of being born in East Africa but raised in the South Bronx. Two different worlds, right? So I was born in Asmara, Eritrea during a time of war, but raised in the South Bronx in Washington, D.C. So I'm what you call blackety black. So this is called, the subheading is a Pan-African double consciousness. As an Eritrean, home will always be hot injera, shiro, boon, spiced tea, homemade popcorn, and Tigrinya songs like Yemene Baria's Kame Alaki blasting in the background. As an African, home is African people with their African ways of seeing the world and their African ways of doing things. Culture is the glue that binds us together. It is often unspoken yet heavily enforced traditions of communalism embedded in everything and everyone African. Home is an amalgamation of rituals that unite us as a people. In this home, we feed the village with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish every single day and then humbly go on about our business. But home is also the South Bronx community I have been attached to my entire life. It's also Afro-Indigenous city women like Brenda, traced to the bloodline of Southern women like Bessie and Little May, who miraculously make something out of nothing. It's the hallway of Christopher Court, a low-income housing project on the Bronx Grand Concourse, drenched in the smell of Auntie Eleanor's candy yams, mac and cheese, and turkey wings. Styrofoam cups filled with red or blue Kool-Aid, a turquoise outfit, white tights, matching barrettes on Easter. It's the feeling we get when the Gap Band Outstanding come on at the cookout. African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans sharing in the joys of arroz con pollo at Family Day. And it's also the imprint of hip-hop and thug life on a young black girl growing up in Marion, Mayor for Life Berries, D.C. Tastemakers, artists, and freedom fighters having Sunday brunch on Lenox Avenue in Harlem or on U Street in D.C. Home is blackness standing on the foundation of black love and black joy. It is the superpower of creating daily magic out of the mere essence of who we are as a people. I want to take you a little further to how I started out this chapter, where I'm talking about Pan-Africanism, and you wouldn't necessarily think of it, but for me, I had to talk about Nipsey Hussle. I had to talk about Nipsey Hussle in this conversation about Pan-Africanism. You know, as Eritreans, we don't have too many famous people in the world. So when they took out Nipsey, they took out 50% of the popularity we have in the world. The only other person that's well known is Tiffany Haddish. I'll leave my comments to myself on that one. And you should leave your comments to yourself too. So Nipsey was a big loss to the culture. We lost a lot. Let me stop for a second and say, free, free Palestine.
Free Palestine.
Yes. So this is where I talk about Nipsey and how I started excavating his legacy when he was killed. And it meant a lot to me as an Eritrean to think about this young man that housed in his body the same complexities that I house. The Black American identity, I mean, he grew up, of course, on the West Coast. I grew up on the East Coast. But being immersed in Black American culture, but having a Black African household to come home to, and how those two worlds could be so dichotomous. And so when he passed away, there were so many young Eritreans that felt that he represented our struggle, our very unique Pan-African struggle. Okay, so I'll read a little excerpt about him. Oskadom was heavily invested in capitalist ideals rooted in enterprise and ownership. Yet he was also keenly aware of how Black artists like him are often threatened, intimidated, and discouraged by arrogant mainstream record companies. Using militaristic language to describe the war that we're fighting and evoking the David and Goliath metaphor, Oskadom argued that hip-hop as a culture was being colonized. In the Double XL interview, he said, hip-hop is like Africa right now. Our natural resources, we're watching them get taken from us. The people that control and own the lion's share of the assets aren't indigenous to the culture at all. Oskadom spoke of hip-hop's indigenous having greater control over the natural resource, the pain, the struggle, the story that makes hip-hop so powerful throughout the world. Arguably, he was more committed to artists having greater independence and control over the means of production than he was in forging a Pan-African pathway for hip-hop. That does not negate his powerful act of imagining a new generation of artists like him decolonizing hip-hop. Now, if you watched the debate the other night, ooh, Jesus Christ, you might want to just go ahead and call me a prophet after I finish reading this excerpt from my book, because I saw all of this coming. So I'm going to read this excerpt when I was warring with what I knew was going to be one of the hardest elections of our lifetimes. And now we realize it's even worse than we ever thought. So this is the section, it's in the chapter called Self-Determination, and I call self-determination the real Black excellence, right? As a contrast to this idea that wealth and capitalism and materialism are Black excellence, self-determination is the real Black excellence. So here's a part where I talk about how our political autonomy is undermined. Another enduring targeted attack on self-determination is on Black political power. The United States would benefit from having more political parties at the forefront of American politics, particularly more that speak honestly about exploitation and oppression with no desire to maintain political correctness. How do we even begin to speak of self-determination without political autonomy? The Democratic Party has taken us for granted for generations. Most recently, millions of people worldwide have demanded a ceasefire in besieged Gaza. After years of being associated with empathy, President Joe Biden maintained unwavering support for Israel's bombardments and invasion, as did almost all of Congress, despite around-the-clock killings of civilians, mostly children and women. Only by continuously raising up our own political leaders and pushing forward our own agenda will this country take us seriously. Despite all the social mobilization and uprisings that have taken place in the U.S. over the past 60 years, this country's two-party system strategically consolidates power to keep new parties from emerging and having viability. And I spent a lot of time writing about South Africa. Let me just say that there was a time in which I was writing this book, and there was a certain nonsense to sit there and write about colonization, to sit there and write about apartheid, because this is ancient history, right? To sit there and write about apartheid in South Africa. And I remember writing these chapters and thinking, these things are not going to relate to anybody but me. And then to know that the Holy Spirit was literally guiding me and showing me what was to come, because there was so much internal debate about how much I was going to say about Palestine. And to be really honest, the world wasn't ready for what I had to say about Israel at the time, but the world got ready really quick, right? And so there's a way in which sometimes we can't do what's comfortable. And I mean, I went to bat with my publishers. You know, like I said to them, I have to go back and put the word genocide in there. You know, and we were ready for print and everything. It does not matter. This could not go to print without the word genocide going in there. And so here is an entire section about South Africa and how they're still facing their own remnants of apartheid. So I'm going to fast forward to this important point about what it means to be self-made. And I think this is an important point to raise up. I'll read one more excerpt before I close out. You know, it's really something else when we're looking to certain people to be thought leaders that a couple of decades ago would have never had legitimacy as thought leaders. We look to entrepreneurs simply based on how many millions they make based on selling brands. So there's a lot of ways in which we have reconfigured what has value. And what would have been worthless to us before has value now. And social media has a lot to do with this. And self-made in many ways before was about the capacity to be resilient and survive. If you were able to survive, you were considered self-made. Self-made now is equivalent to millionaires and billionaires. And it's given our young people a delusioned sense of what accomplishment and success look like, right? So it's not simply about taking care of your family, making sure everybody got food to eat, but no, you gotta be a multi-millionaire to feel like you're doing something. You got to have 1 million followers. We have set the bar so high, but the standard is so low. In the United States, individualism is normalized. People are celebrated for being successful, even if that means they were unjust and unkind along the way. Our culture glorifies stories of how people overcome all the odds stacked against them and went on to achieve the American dream. TV stars and their lavish lifestyles are idolized without consideration for the generational imprint they are making. Billionaires become thought leaders and political influencers simply because they have inherited our amassed limitless wealth. In our context, self-determination has morphed into self-made, with the likes of the Kardashians being celebrated for building up media, beauty, and fashion empires. This is an important point to make. Let the day come when the legacy of America's heroes is evaluated by our community-driven standards. On that day, we will separate the narcissists from the truth tellers. We will glorify our martyrs rather than those perfected the use of enslaving tools, the enslavers' tools. Success will be based on communal principles rather than individual profit. No longer will we center the table as our benchmark for progress. Instead, we will celebrate the visionaries and griots of our time who can envision Afrofuturistic freedoms that have yet to be actualized. The American empire's desire to identify our heroes for us is a tool of domination that has multi-generational implications. The media cherry picks the names it wants us to immortalize. So we're in a church. We're in a powerful church. And so with that, I have to raise up the chapter in the book that talks about decolonizing God. Theological decolonization demands that we unlearn years of false theology and separate our faith from the traps of capitalism. Some of us don't know the difference between pursuing the American dream and pursuing a life of faith. We think a relationship with God guarantees us material wealth, financial security, and the absence of problems. We fail to distinguish our spiritual beliefs from our capitalistic aspirations. God does not promise us the American dream. I'll say that again. God does not promise us the American dream. Yes. And if we are being honest, we can admit that the seduction of the American dream is often in direct opposition to the self-sacrifice, communalism, and life of minimalism that Jesus encourages. We may not be worshiping a molten golden calf like the children of Israel in the book of Exodus, but we have contemporary false gods of our own. Today, those idols might come in the form of job titles, annual salaries, retirement packages, home equity, and designer goods. It's anything that we put our trust and faith in rather than believing in manna, provision from God to meet our daily needs. The last excerpt that I want to read, because I can't stop this without doing it, is it's going to be on Gaza. And, you know, you go through life experiences and you don't know why you're going through them until you can look back and understand that God had a plan all along the way. And there was a way in which, for me, visiting Ferguson and Palestine was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. It changed my relationship to the United States. I never saw the U.S. the same again. I knew that I could not maintain my idealism as an immigrant after what I'd seen. And so I thank the people in those places who forever changed me. It was because of them that I moved to South Africa and lived there for 3 years. And so in honor of those people, I think I'm getting emotional because I'm acknowledging that my old self died. You know, every now and then you grieve the person you used to be, and you have to forgive that person. You have to forgive them for what they knew and didn't know. You know, and there was a lot that I didn't know about the world. And once I knew, I was never the same again. And so I can be kind to myself because I did something with what I learned, you know. And I am somebody who went to Stanford. I'm somebody who went to Yale. And I'm somebody who studied at Oxford. I'm somebody who taught at Princeton. And I took all that education and I unlearned it to be good for my people. Because I learned that all that education had no value for the liberation of my people. None whatsoever. And so it wasn't until I learned from the people, the people's history, the people's knowledge, the people's stories, the people's struggles, the people's songs, their chants, everything that made the people what they are. In Africa, in Cuba, all these places that I have been immersed in struggle. It wasn't until I learned those stories that I became of good use to my people. What does it mean to be so heavenly bound that you're no earthly good? I was no earthly good. So I want to read this last paragraph. First, what I'm talking about is what the geography in South Africa looks like today. What I'm talking about is how everything in South Africa is designed to separate the white suburbans from the black township people. Everything is about containment, keeping people where they belong, right? Now, we know about that. This obsession with containment reminded me of my ministry in prisons. Through security screenings, every effort was made to ensure nothing entered that could free the imprisoned people, always disproportionately black. Beyond the Bible, that is. In the U.S. context, these practices of occupation originate with our government's genocidal acts and ongoing atrocities against indigenous people. More than any other place, occupied Palestine made me personally aware of freedom of movement, as well as the link between liberation and land. As I witnessed in the West Bank, Palestinians are dominated through border walls, checkpoints, and the presence of the Israel Defense Forces. Gaza, which is facing the threat of genocide and ethnic cleansing, a 2023 Nakba, as I write this, is widely known as the world's largest open-air prison. Palestinians, like South Africans, have continuously resisted settler colonialism and apartheid, a crime against humanity. In post-apartheid South Africa, the privatized residential replication of prisons prevails to keep the oppressed where they belong. Thank you very much.
Come on, let's just appreciate Rahiel one more time for that reading. That was just so amazing, and we are so grateful for her putting her voice to these words. Pastor Jackie is going to join us on stage because there's a whole lot that we want to unpack and talk. But if you're online and you have some questions you'd like to ask, you can put it in the Facebook chat. If you're here today and you have some questions you want to ask for the last, say, 15 minutes or so, we're going to provide some opportunities for questions from the audience. At my cue, you can just kind of line up on my right, that far aisle, my right, your left, and we'll get an opportunity to engage you around some questions. All right? Let's appreciate Pastor Dr. Jacqueline Thompson from the Allen Temple Baptist Church.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, those of you who are joining us online. But most of all, thank you for your work and for your reading. So appropriate, so timely, particularly with everything that we're struggling with. And so I said to myself, as I shared earlier, before I start with the chapters of the book, I want to start with your introduction that you entitled A Freedom Journey. Mm-hmm. And so you opened by grounding us in what was going on for you and the loss that you had sustained. And you talk about how you landed in South Africa, the partnerships that you established with people there to help them with the freedom work that they were doing. Mm-hmm. And then you have this phrase, and you said it was as a result of that work that you began to truly imagine freedom. And so I'm of the mind, living in these days and times, that life is designed to kill our imagination. Mm. There are so many people that struggle to be able to imagine so many things, but especially freedom for a people who continue the fight of oppression. And so I would love to hear why you think the idea of being able to dream and being able to imagine is so important to the fight.
Wow. Well, first, let me just give y'all an invitation to experience what I experienced that helped me imagine freedom. When I say we, it was a collective of movements from all over the world. And we were multicultural, we were multi-class-based, multiracial. There were no boundaries and limits on what we looked like and who we represented. I mean, there were people from Tunisia, Arab people from Tunisia. There were Cubans amongst me. There were a lot of Africans, West, South. I was the only East African at the time. And there was a way in which all of us came together, bringing our shared struggles into that space. And we lived together. You know, I don't often talk about these experiences and these memories, partly to protect my comrades and to protect the sacredness of everything that we went through, but we lived together. I lived in a room full of bunk beds. with a Congolese woman, a Jamaican woman. I had the top bunk bed. There was a sister under me, and the room was the size of a closet. And we had to shower together. We had to figure it all out. We had to figure it all out. And we ate together, but we didn't only eat together. We grocery shopped, we cooked, we washed dishes. And there was a way in which we had to unlearn our distinction of intellectualism versus militancy, because I had always done intellectual work, but we had to understand that washing dishes was militant work, you know, because everybody's labor had to be respected. And you couldn't say that you respected the labor of everybody if you were not willing to just roll up your sleeve and do what had to be done. And all this to raise up the beauty of that space. I mean, some of the most powerful experiences were the culture nights that we had, and we also would engage in documenting our experiences. And so all of this is just happening, but you're not always reflecting on the intersections between that and, say, the Black Panthers, and how the Black Panthers lived together, how the Black Panthers established their own intercommunalism, and how they created newspapers to document their stories, right? So when you engage in really militant liberation work, you have to create an infrastructure. And that infrastructure is rooted in political education, educating the masses. In the United States, we simply go out in the streets and we protest. That is one of the biggest failures of this country, that we don't have an infrastructure to politically educate people. I've always been obsessed with building a leadership academy, because the next we keep talking about this generation, we keep talking about Biden and Obama, but where's the next generation, right? How do we think beyond these old white men? How do we get beyond this system, this failed system? And so imagining freedom for me started by me seeing us being free. It started by me seeing us doing things and singing songs that were not normalized in the American mainstream, right? It started with us making our cultures the standard, and not starting from the standard of whiteness as superior. So when you start to see freedom, you can begin to imagine it. And this notion of dreaming, all of us brought our own dreams of our homelands. My liberation work starts with Eritrea as my starting point for the work that I do. My country has never been free. I don't care if we have these independence days. We've had dictators in office for, decades and decades. We got money and corruption. We got all kinds of things that are happening that do not allow us to truly know freedom. And so we came with this collective dreaming of what our countries could look like if we were truly free. And that notion that maybe for you it's land. Maybe for you the emphasis is labor. Maybe for you it's about job acquisitions and having natural resources at your disposal. All of us were dreaming of different things, but we all wanted freedom. And I think in strengthening our own capacity to realize those dreams, we no longer centered their history, their way of doing things, but it became about our history and what we knew we had to do for our people and our countries and our homelands.
Yes, man. Come on, clap it up for that, everybody. That was... I would love for you, perhaps, to just talk a little bit about the three parts of your book and why you chose those three frames of resilience, resistance, and redemption. And obviously, we've walked together through probably a lot of these seasons, but, I am curious about how do you think about resilience, how do you think about resistance, and how do you think about redemption in the context of, being a mom now, you know, because when we were walking together, you
I was nobody's mama.
you know, and you know, we're just a little older, you know, like just curious, like just to riff off that for a few minutes.
I've always been obsessed with the children of Israel in the Bible. It is one of my theological obsessions. And I've been obsessed with them because, one, I see all the parallels between the children of Israel and Black Americans. How can you not see the parallel between a people subjugated and oppressed for 400 years in Egypt, a land that was not their homeland, who are constantly trying to figure out how to sing the Lord's song in a strange land, a people who are exiles? If it's not the Black American story, then I don't know what is, right? So there's a way in which I've always been obsessed with the children of Israel. So the book is divided through their journey. That freedom journey is the journey that the children of Israel took. They were in exile in Egypt, and they were under Pharaoh's control. They were under Pharaoh's rule, and they came to the wilderness led by Moses, who you could argue is a community organizer, led by Moses into the wilderness. And even though they were led into freedom, they were not ready for freedom. Could you imagine being enslaved for 400 years and that not being enough time to be ready for freedom? They weren't ready for freedom. So they come into the wilderness and they're talking about the food that Pharaoh used to feed them, and how good Pharaoh and how Pharaoh dressed, and how Pharaoh's palace looked. They wanted the ways of Pharaoh, right? Sound awfully familiar, right? So God, one, had to be really upset because there was a lack of gratitude. You could have freedom but not appreciate it, right? So there was this lack of gratitude. And then there was this vision that God had for the promised land, and these people were not fit to make it into the promised land. And what happened? A whole generation had to die away to create fertile ground for the promised land. I'm fascinated by that story. And part of it, and I preached a sermon at this church once about it, about how they had a certain form of Stockholm syndrome, where they were holding on to their captor and romanticizing their captor, right? And so I'm fascinated by that story and how it sounds and looks a lot like our Black American story today. You know, what I mean by that is we don't have the same type of shackles and bondage that we had once upon a time. But what we do have is this psychological enslavement, where we are convinced that the values of the European way, the beauty of the European way, that Europeans have everything we want and need, and that what is indigenous to us, what God gave to us, what is intrinsic to us is no earthly good, right? It's a rejection of God, and it's idol worship of Europeans, to be real. And so I take us through that journey because for us to get free, we got to stop worshiping what the Europeans told us was beautiful. We got to stop worshiping what they told us was valuable. And one of the things that we also have to do is that in Egypt, they trained us to work. They trained us to be laborers and slaves. And we today, 400 years, are still defining our worth by our productivity. We don't feel worthy unless we're doing something. We can't sit still. And now, even if you're not working, you're scrolling. There's a way in which we're feeding the beast every single moment, right? Like, so if we're not at somebody's job clocking in, we're paying the Zuckerbergs of the world when we're scrolling on our phones, or we're driving our Teslas, whatever it is, somebody's getting paid off of our need to feel like we have value.
Touch your knee.
If you can't say amen, say ouch. So very true. My grandmother used to say, we believe the white man's ice is colder. That's how they would encapsulate that same thought. But speaking of that, the idea of technology, and you talk about that in one of your chapters, the ways in which you think sometimes social media, news media, print media, and even technology has been detrimental to this idea of freedom. Can you help us understand that fuller?
Man, I'm a product of the media. I'm a former Washington Post columnist. I was editor-in-chief of the Washington Informer in Washington, D.C., and I started my own outlet, Urban Cusp, which is how I started to get national prominence when I started curating my own news. So I'm a media maker, and I'm a media maker because I believe in the power of propaganda. Whatever power you want to use that propaganda for, it has power. And so I believe that all social movements, all liberation struggles have understood the power of media. If you look back to Eritrea and our fight against Ethiopia, I went back and I found the newspapers that they used to create. You teach the masses to prepare them for revolution. And that is the power that freedom seekers have always understood about media, that the masses have to be prepared. The conditions have to be set for revolution. You can't just wake up and tell people that it's time to revolt. You have to prepare them. And so that was the use of media. Now, if you don't want the people to revolt, if you don't want the masses to be politically informed, you have to have alternative media that conforms them, makes them apathetic, and that leads them to believe that everything is fine just as it is. You know, it took me a long time to understand that no media is neutral, ever. There's no such thing as neutral media. It all has an objective, right? And so I talk about the media as an arm of white supremacy. It shapes the way that we understand beauty. And that's really important, because if you are told you are made in the image of God, but you define yourself as ugly or hideous or unattractive, what are you saying about your God? Right? So it's not only a cosmetic conversation, it's a theological danger. It's a theological danger to believe their standards are the standards that you should set for your life, because then you start looking at your God as inferior, right? If you're made in that image, your God is less than, or you should be worshiping their God. So there are all these ways in which the media sneaks into our perception of theology. It sneaks into our perception of what is important and not important. I mean, if you wake up every single day and hear about the Kardashians, like, I'm blown away by the media environment that we're living in, right? There's just a way in which the media, I mean, you could look at it, the best way to look at it is water. The media dilutes our understanding of the world, literally just pouring water on everything to make us think that what we think has substance doesn't really have substance at all. You know, and so I don't think that we should forfeit the fight for media. I think people of color, I think women should always be media creators, content creators, always. Because the minute that we stop creating content is when we lost the war.
Okay, so to know me is to know I'm supposed to be in order, but I just never am. Okay? And so I'm going to encourage you, first of all, if you are online or in the chat, ask your questions. We want to make sure that this time is fruitful and you get your questions asked as well. But a theme has come up, and you all have heard it too. So in every answer, you have alluded to the idea of readiness. And so for me, I can't go any further without finding out. The book is a call to imagine freedom. But are we ready?
We don't have a choice. I mean, it's like when you're birthing a baby. Are you ready to birth a baby? Are you ready to bring that baby into the world? Or do you realize this baby got to get out one way or the other, right? I think that's the best way that I could compare it. You're never ready to birth a child. You could have had 10. You're never ready, because when you think about what it takes, when you think about what it's going to do to your body, what it's going to do to your spirit, how long it's going to take for you to recover. I mean, when you really think about it, you'll talk yourself out of it. But it's something else when you say, hey, the time has come and I don't have a choice. And I think that's where we are. We're at that place of the time has come and I don't have a choice anymore. I got to do this for my baby girl. I got to do it for her because, I mean, even climate control, what kind of world is she going to breathe and take in? I mean, we're dealing with 96 degrees in Washington, D.C. in June. In June, what is my child going to deal with when she's 60 years old, right? We don't have a choice but to get ready. And if this election hasn't shown us that we are always about 30 years behind where we need to be. Yeah. 30 years behind. Because who is the next set of presidents? Who's the next set of council members? The next set of congressional officials? We don't know where they are. They're not ready, right? Because we have this place where we just hold up the old, what we're used to, what's familiar. And our minds have to let that die. We have to say we are ready for radical change. I've been throwing the word radical in front of everything. Just put it on top of everything, right? Like hot sauce, just radical everything, right? Because we're too comfortable. Yeah. We're too comfortable. We're too complacent. I don't want my child to inherit this world. I don't. And I want to believe that I'm going to have grandchildren that are going to inherit a better world as well. So what does that mean? It means that we don't have a choice but to armor up. Yeah. And it's a specific word that I'm using of armor. You know, sometimes being Christians can make us very, 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 very docile. We're taught meekness. But Jesus was immersed in a war. Jesus was immersed in a spiritual war that had multi-generational implications and that would affect us for thousands of years to come. He knew what he was up against, right? And we playing games like it's about churches and foundation dollars and it's about building funds and it's about tithes and offerings. No, you are in a multi-generational spiritual war. Yeah. And they're coming for your kids. They're coming for your grandkids. They're coming for your mind. And they're attacking your mental health because if they destroy your mind, they destroy your family, right? Right. We're not even looking at this the way that we should be looking at this. So I'm not trying to make anybody comfortable anymore, right? White folks got to get uncomfortable. You got to get uncomfortable. You really do. Like, you can't sit in that whiteness. It's like sitting in filth sometimes and just being comfortable with the filth. There's a way in which whiteness has been filthy, right? And it gets to a point where you say it's time to clean up. And I think we're at that point where it's time to clean up, because when you clean up is when you get ready to dress up and get ready for war.
All right, I'm gonna fall back, I promise. But since we're there, and since we are throwing radical around like hot sauce, okay, well, November cometh, right? So we in church, that's the King James Version, November cometh. The NIV, November is coming. So what in your estimation is the radical choice for freedom seekers in November, who feel like their only two choices are hell on one side and damnation on the other?
Run for your life.
Say, they not like us.
They not like us. They not like us. Oh, these are scary times. These are scary times. And this is why we have the Bible. Because there's nothing new under the sun. Right. There's nothing new. I mean, story after story after story in the Bible is about a king that is raised up to deceive the children of Israel. It's about a king that's raised up to take them from the ways of their God, to lead them towards idolatry, to lead them towards criminality, to lead them towards worship of pagan gods. I mean, it's king after king after king. That's what the whole entire Old Testament is. The naming of kings and prophets, right? And so if we look at it in that sequence, this is a continuum of what has been happening for thousands of years, and nothing is different, right? What is important about this moment is that we're now seeing them for what they really are. They're all pharaohs under a different name. They're all Don't you think it's interesting that Pharaoh was never given a name in the Old Testament? Never given a name. The kings used to have the name, but Pharaoh was never given a name. And the beauty of Pharaoh not having a name is that all of them fall under Pharaoh. All of them fall under Pharaoh, right? Because all of them are the people under oppression and a Pharaoh that refuses to let them go. Whatever the oppression may be is different, right? The oppression may change, but Pharaoh's heart is hardened and Pharaoh refuses to let them go. I think we got two Pharaohs right now, okay? One might be red, one might be blue, but they two Pharaohs. Now, some might say, I'm going to choose the lesser evil, right? I'm going to choose the Pharaoh that I could live with, that my children could live with. Or I'm not even going to focus on Pharaoh. I'm going to focus on the administration that Pharaoh falls under. We have all these ways in which we're going to make sense of this election. But I do think we need to start spiritually analyzing these political times that we're in. Because it was the kings and the pharaohs of the Bible who would slaughter the firstborn. And that's happening under a Democratic president right now, right? So how different are you going to tell me these presidents and these candidates are when they're doing the same thing that Pharaoh was doing? So there's a way in which I'm not interested in trying to clean Pharaoh up so that he's palatable for me, right? But I do understand that some of us are not willing to deal with the other side. And my heart goes to anybody who has that fear. But you know what? I think it's scary either way. I do. The devil that you see and the devil that's hiding from you are both scary. I would never tell anybody who to vote for. But what I think is important is to say that this political moment gives us a need to think of our long-term exit strategy. And that's the excerpt that I read from the book. I think the Democrats have proven that they are the old guard. They are no longer fit to lead a new generation of freedom seekers. There was a time when Black Americans and the middle class thought that the Democratic Party was the way to go. The Democratic Party, especially in this year, has shown it does not have the values of future generations. It is simply conforming and sustaining a system that we want to die. And so we got to envision the system we want to build and build new parties and build new leaders, right? So whatever you do in this election is your business. That's you in the booth. But if we talk about the way forward, and I'm not talking about 10, 20, 30 years from now. I'm talking about today, tomorrow, the way forward. What are those leaders? What are those political parties that we're going to birth, going back to birthing, right? We don't have a choice. It gets to the point where you don't have a choice but to birth. And so the dead is gone. It's time to birth.
Radical.
Yes. Any questions? Anyone have any questions you'd like to ask Rahiel as we wind down here? We got about 15 more minutes with Rahiel. If not, we're going to keep asking her questions. Come on over to this side so they can get you on camera for the sake of our...
I came all the way from Washington, D.C., so don't be shy.
Oh, is this on? There it is. Thank you for your work. I'm very impressed and excited to see you here in my church and the co-hosts. So it was Nelson Mandela who said that the world in South Africa was not free until Palestine was free.
Right.
Also, Angela Davis said that we can't give up on the future due to the present, or our ancestors' work would have been for naught. I was born in Alabama in 1960. Segregation, I was born in a segregated maternity ward. What are your thoughts on the current Academy of Training Leadership that you talked about? Pastor Mike's talked about a prophet school, to talk about prophetic people being brought up. And also there's the number of groups that are out there right now, Crisis Readiness Corps in Oakland. They're out on the street day to day, leadership building. So there's all kinds of master classes going on right now about activism. So how do you envision us building in our pregnancy moment as we carry this child into the future? It may not be here now, but where do you show and see the hope for the future from what you see today?
It's a multi-layered question.
Yeah. I tend to do that, sorry.
No, it's fine. Well, I did use the word unlearning. It's a powerful word. There's a certain, learning can be driven by ego, where we think that we have acquired, and because there's all these metrics to tell you that you have what it takes. You have what it takes to be a doctor. You have what it takes to be a lawyer. You've done this. You've taken this test. And then you check it off the list. If I do this, then I have this. I have this knowledge that helps me be better for my community. Because most of the jobs that we're talking about are jobs centered in community, right? But what if I said that most of that is not useful to any of us, truly useful to any of us, meaning that what we learn is designed to make us conform. From the time that a child starts school, they're listening to bells and alarms. It's very similar to prison. They're being trained to follow rules when the notion of protest and activism is to resist the rules, right? So learning teaches you to accept everything that you're seeing. Unlearning makes you question everything that you're seeing. And there's a way in which you learn, you stop asking questions. There's a way in which learning can often lead you to think that you have the answers. Go ahead.
Push back just a little bit. So as a lawyer of 25 years, the skills and the training that I obtained, I could use in the right way with the right leadership. So with regard to unlearning things, I definitely agree. But others who have medical training, those who have legal training, economic training, we could do it for a different purpose without that white supremacy foundation, do it in an Afrocentric way. And I'm just trying to say, how do we redesign our learning without throwing away those skills that some of us have done and questioned as we did it, questioning our law professors and those things. So
yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I'm a very learned person. I have a MDiv. I have all kind of degrees, and I've spent my whole life learning. I'm being very serious when I say that what I have found to be most useful to my people did not come in the classroom. It did not. I mean, I studied in these classrooms, and I learned from professors who had maybe 20, 30, 40 years of study. I don't remember anything they ever taught me. I don't. I remember Ferguson. I remember Palestine. I remember Johannesburg, South Africa. I remember Ethiopia, Haiti. Let me tell you, I once went to Haiti, and I could have read and been taught a million things about Haiti, but the most important lesson I'd ever learned about Haiti in my life was going into an orphanage, seeing a room full of babies who were not crying. What that taught me, a room full of babies in cribs who are not crying, that taught me more than anything that I could have ever learned at Stanford, right? It's not to dismiss formal education, because I'm a product of it, but it is to encourage travel, beyond poverty tourism, beyond just going somewhere to see how much better your life is than somebody else's. And I hate this new thing where, like, everybody wants to have luxury experiences overseas now. We become the colonizers, right? We go to other people's indigenous lands and tell them to dance and sing and feed us and do whatever we need to feel like we got our money worth for our all-expense-paid trip, right? So what I'm talking about is, how do you immerse yourself in the world in a way in which you truly learn? Radical immersion. There are things that you can... Radical immersion.
And can I just say real quick, I mean, I think that's very powerful and interesting, particularly for all of us who are quite privileged, right? And, you know, formal education in the Western world is a privilege. And it seeks to turn you into a privileged person, right? Like it changes your, it changes your appetite. It changes your aesthetics. It changes your, even as you learn to be a critical thinker, it's rare that your critical thinking turns back against the very system itself. Your critical thinking turns on poor people or on systems that are so abstract that you can't actually attack the institutions that uphold the systems. So just imagine, I mean, there was this, can't remember the name of this, this movie that took boys to Africa. It was called Boys of Barack.
Yeah.
Baltimore. Like, and I remember that first came out. You know, can you imagine if every single young person in the Bay Area were able to spend a year in radical immersion, or every single young adult, or every single adult, rather than us spending the $20-something thousand a year we spend to keep them, try to trick them to stay in middle school, right? And if they don't stay in middle school, then they get suspended. Like that, our tax dollars could be used very differently to do radical immersion. I think that's part of what we who are privileged, we have to start thinking, how can we leverage our privilege to actually create another form of formation?
And we do that. Our church does that. We've been sending young people to Africa probably for about 10, 15 years now. And I have to say, of all of the things that churches do, that is the one thing where our young people come back radically changed.
Wow. There you go.
They have made different life choices. Many of them are in ministry. Many of them are engaging in justice work because what they experienced there in those 10 days brought so much perspective to their lives and how they were living here. We would have young people who would leave with luggage and come back with nothing because they left everything over there. And they continue that immersion today. But not to change the subject, but can I shift it just a bit? Mm-hmm. Because you named all of the countries. We're talking about radical immersion and certainly an avenue that is transformative. But you also talked about in the Pan-African section of your book how you are managing diverse identities. And I would love to hear what you would say to Black Americans, because sometimes they struggle with the idea of Pan-Africanism and the whole, they don't feel the connection to Africa in that way. They feel like motherless children because they trace their history back to 1619, to the plantation. They don't know anything about it. But you definitely lift up that Pan-Africanism is one of the things we have to begin to look at as a collective and an alternative to the American dream. But speak to those who struggle with that and who don't feel at home either place.
I'm so glad that you segued into that, because while we were talking about the previous question, there's a phrase in my book, there's a section called Pan-African Immersion. And what it talks about is Che Guevara taking up arms in Angola. And when I was living on the continent, I went through a lot of things as an American, where my American privilege became very evident to me and everybody else around me. And it was difficult, you know. I would become angry because there was a part of me that felt like, well, I don't have to be here now, you know. I mean, I don't have to be here. But But I humbled myself and realized that this was my first time truly being a student as an adult, because I was there to teach, but I was really there to learn. And one of the comrades, the elder comrade, said to me, "You got to remember Che." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "He took up arms for African people. He came here and he lived among the people in Angola." And what I never forgot about that was, it's something different when you're willing to live, sleep, and eat with people. You can read their struggle all you want, but until part of what changed me was sleeping in a house in Ramallah, sleeping in a house in Hebron. Like, when we took that delegation to Palestine, we slept in homes where we could see tear gas canisters on a table. Mm-hmm. You see little girls who are talking about, standing up against soldiers. Like, it's those experiences that transform me. I can't tell you nothing about what I learned in my American studies at Stanford. I don't remember. I don't care, right? But I'll never forget being in Palestine. I'll never forget being in Johannesburg and living and talking to the Congolese sister. Like, I just won't ever, when you talk about transformation is an inside job. So when I push back on the formal education, there has to be synergy between the mind and the heart. And you can internalize everything that you will ever internalize in terms of information, but it never reaches your heart. But when you're in those places and you're seeing those people crying, you're seeing those tears, it will touch the heart. So that's where I get to Pan-African immersion. So I have always juggled this identity as Black and African. And I've always felt like I've had to pick a side. When you're Black and you're African, the reality is they've taught us to hate one another.
Yes.
So if you're Black American, you think that the Africans are savages. And you think I'm playing. I was a little girl, and they would touch my hair and be like, "But your hair doesn't look the way it looks on those TV commercials." And then I would be amongst family members who might say, "Oh, Black Americans, they're all drug dealers." And you look at these people and you're like, how the hell could they talk to each other? like, how can they be saying these things, right? Yeah. Oh, but then when I went to Eritrea and saw what they watch on TV all day, and then I saw the commercials for Arab cosmetics from Saudi Arabia and bleaching creams, then it all started to make sense and come together, right? Right? So there's a way in which our hatred of each other is their victory. Our hatred of one another is their victory.
Wow.
I use this story, this image of love letters between Africa and Black America. They've been intercepting these love letters all our lives. We love each other. You see it through the culture. You see it through the food, the music, the religion. We are one. We don't even have to know each other. We are each other, right? But they've been intercepting the love letters, and we have to reclaim them. We have to change the edits that they've made, and find what was there before they got to those letters.
That's good.
You got a question?
That's a great place. That's a great place. Right there. And thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So you telling me that America is the Mr. in color purple? That's what you say.
No, it is. It's so funny you said that, because I use the analogy of the Notebook. Who saw the Notebook? Okay. Yeah. You remember the mother stealing the letters? Okay. So that's what I put in my book. But then when I saw the color purple again, I said, man, I should have used Mr.
Yeah, we get it. I wanted to ask a question about, because of this current climate, and you were like, your first initial reaction, like, we gotta run, like we gotta hide, or hide wives, hide kids. But a lot of people, Black Americans, are wrestling with the notion of leaving the country, becoming expatriates somewhere else. And I know you've lived abroad for a while. With that angle, could you speak to the pros, the cons. Is this an option that we should be? Should we be abandoning ship and getting up out of here? Or then where in the world do we go that's not anti-black? Right.
That's not anti-black.
That's not
Go to Marita.
anti.
That's an excellent question. And, you know, when I was in Dakar, Senegal, you know the Americans by the accents. So anytime I would hear an American accent, I would say, hey, where are you from? You know, they would tell me what city they were from. And a lot of them had taken DNA tests, found out, you know, their tribal origins, their ethnic origins, and come back to the city or location where that tribe was to try to get a sense of their identity. So it's already happening. Not to mention Ghana is giving, you know, people claim to land. So Ghana is making it very seductive. I mean, if you want somewhere to start, a lot of people starting in Ghana. Okay, I personally love South Africa. I do. You know, South Africa to me is probably my favorite country in the world. I really do love it. Now you got to deal with the fears of your safety and crime and organized crime and all of that. But you know, no.
Yeah,
little
no
small
worries,
things.
no worries.
There are freedoms in this country that I would, you know, the freedom to be able to walk around and be on my cell phone in the United States is a freedom I cannot deny. You don't have that freedom in certain places on the continent, right? I don't want to romanticize the continent because I have literally been all over the world, lived, stayed. The longest away time was 3 years. And I can say that the United States affords us privileges that are hard to find anywhere else in the world. It does, which is why you have immigrants coming from all over the world to be here, not to mention they've made our homeland so horrible that we have no choice but to come here, right? But what I would say is that in all those places, what I had to figure out was when I was leaving, what was gonna happen. So it wasn't about, oh, I'm on African soil for 3 years. It was now I'm leaving and I'm returning to America. What does that look like? And I started grieving the woman that I had been for those 3 years on the continent because I wanted to stay her, you know? And I had a friend who, I write about this in the book, who talked to me about Malcolm's Hajj to Mecca. And what he said is that Malcolm's Hajj to Mecca renamed him. He took on a new name, and we know biblically naming is everything. Naming is your identity. And so when his name changed from Malcolm X, it wasn't about having an African name. It was about adorning this new identity. He came back with a new name. He came back with a new purpose, a new mission. So it didn't matter where he was. And that's Kwame Nkrumah's quote about, I'm not African because I was born in Africa. I'm African because it was born in me. Black Americans don't ever have to go to Africa necessarily. I recommend it, but not all of us are gonna have that privilege. I mean, you talk about the streets of the Bay and the town. How many people here are gonna have money to go to Africa, right? It's not gonna happen for everybody, but how can Africa be born in our people? And it can be born in our people through our values. We are a communal people, period. Black Americans will be shocked by how African we are. I'm serious. There are things that we joke about. You know how we talk, you know you black?
Yeah.
You might as well say, you know you African. Because there are communal ways of being. There are ways that we're resourceful. We don't throw anything away. We're going to figure out how to make use of it 10 million times.
All those hangers and plastic
all those,
bags.
all those hangers.
Y'all keep.
All these things that we joke about. But these are our cultural artifacts.
Yeah.
These are ways in which we have retained the memory of being African. I live with an African man, so I know that man can fix anything in the world. I'm never had any formal training. How do you know how to fix that, right? Because we had to survive. They had to figure it out. There was no technician to call. There was no lighter, no electrician. There was no plumber. They had to figure it out, right? But that's how we joke about black people being resourceful. So there are ways in which Africa has already been born in us. Now, the key is, how do we politicize that? Not simply being African for cultural purposes, but how are you African in such a way that it changes your politics?
My goodness.
Yeah.
Let's clap it up, everybody, for Rahiel Tesfamariam. So appreciative for you being here. We were going to offer a free book to the first 25 folk, and so it looked like all y'all going to get a free book. Now, if you like to leave a donation, you certainly could. That would be amazing. $5, $10, $20. Somebody say, man. But we're going to create some space for Rahiel to just catch her breath. Our brother's going to put the table up here, and you can get a book signed from Rahiel. Or maybe we'll bring it down to the bottom and have a little more space. And get a chance just to take a picture with her. If she so desires, she can sign your book. And y'all can just appreciate and love on Reverend Rahiel Tesfamariam. She will be here preaching at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and so you'll get a chance to hear her preach. And while after you're done, or while you're waiting to greet Reverend Rahiel, you should greet Reverend Dr. Jackie Thompson, too, and ask her, when is she coming to preach out the way?
You know what?
I mean, it would just be such a great question. Maybe she'll give you the answer. No. Everybody, Reverend Rahiel Tesfamariam, Reverend Dr. Jackie Thompson, let's appreciate them for being here this afternoon.
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah, can we get a picture? Somebody get a good picture of me and my friends.
You gotta go in the middle. Okay.